The year is 2011. These are typical scenes from what could be any school classroom in the United States of America, in the North, the East, the West, and even the South. The United States Constitution guarantees liberty and equal opportunity to all. These basic rights have not always been provided as promised. From the earliest times in America, the U.S. educational system mandated separate schools for children based on race. In many cases, the schools for African American children were inferior to the schools that white children attended. Debates in court against segregated schools go as far back as 1849. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, the inclusion of African Americans as full citizens required amending the U.S. Constitution. The 14th Amendment, ratified 3 years later, gave citizenship to previously enslaved people of African descent and gave them equal protection under the law. This amendment greatly increased the protection of civil rights to all Americans. Jim Crow is a character in a 19th century minstrel song that mocked African Americans. The term Jim Crow eventually was used to refer to a group of laws and customs that allowed segregation in the United States. Louisiana passed the first Jim Crow law in 1890, requiring separate railroad cars for whites and blacks. In 1892, Homer Plessy was arrested for sitting in the white railroad car. Plessy was of mixed descent and was technically only 1/8 black. He could pass for white, however he identified himself as black to the railroad officials and refused to move to the blacks-only car. A black civil rights organization worked with Plessy to challenge this Jim Crow law in court. After being defeated in the Louisiana courts, the case titled Plessy v. Ferguson went to the United States Supreme Court. Plessy's lawyers argued that the Jim Crow law violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. The Supreme Court ruled against Plessy, finding Louisiana's separate but equal law constitutional. The Plessy decision set the precedent that separate facilities for whites and blacks were constitutional as long as they were equal. This landmark case downgraded blacks to second-class citizenship and resulted in laws requiring separate dining facilities, restrooms, transportation, and schools for whites and blacks in northern and southern states. Parents of African American children began to fight against segregation in public schools before the Civil War. In the first documented school desegregation case, Roberts v. City of Boston, in 1849, the courts denied Benjamin Roberts and other African American parents the right to enroll their children in certain Boston public schools. In Kansas alone, there were 11 similar cases from the years 1881 to 1949. The NAACP took a key role in the move towards ending discrimination and segregation. Segregation had a negative impact on blacks in many ways, including limiting access to quality education and job opportunities. Starting in the 1940s, NAACP leaders worked to end the policy of separate but equal. Public schools were their first targets, and their efforts ultimately changed the course of history. Charles Hamilton Houston, dean of Howard Law School, argued most of the early NAACP school segregation cases. After Houston died, Thurgood Marshall became the lead counsel for these cases. In 1951, in Topeka, Kansas, Linda Brown had to travel about an hour each way to her black elementary school, even though a white school was only a few minutes away. Oliver Brown tried to enroll his daughter in the white elementary school, but the principal of the school refused. Brown went to the head of Topeka's branch of the NAACP for assistance. The NAACP recruited 12 other African American families for a class action suit against the Topeka School Board. This and 4 other cases from Delaware, Washington, D.C., South Carolina, and Virginia were appealed to the United States Supreme Court when none of the cases were successful in district courts. The Supreme Court combined the cases because each sought the same relief from segregated schools for African Americans. The combined case became known as Brown v. Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall was the lead counsel for the plaintiffs. He argued that segregation was detrimental to blacks, and that separate but equal ruling violated the 14th Amendment. Thurgood Marshall won the debate because on May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision that segregation was unconstitutional and violated the 14th Amendment. Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, stated, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." African Americans celebrated the Supreme Court's decision. However, they would soon find out that the separate but equal debate was far from over. The Supreme Court made segregation unconstitutional. However, the ruling only ordered that states end segregation with all deliberate speed. This imprecision in the ruling allowed those who were opposed to it to avoid compliance. Although many whites supported the Brown decision, many whites, particularly in the South, were opposed to it. White supremacy was a part of Southern culture that dated back to the times of slavery, and as a result, Southern opposition to all forms of desegregation was fierce. Integration protests erupted on the streets across the country. These actions made it clear that the nation was deeply divided on this issue and that it would be difficult to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. In 1957, 3 years after the Brown ruling, 9 black students enrolled in the all-white Little Rock Central High School. These students became known to the world as the Little Rock Nine. On September 3, 1957, the 9 students arrived at Central High School and were greeted by an angry mob of people protesting and shouting threats. The day before school opened, the governor of Arkansas called the National Guard to surround Central High, declaring blood would run in the streets if black students attempted to enter. The soldiers prevented the 9 students from entering the school. After the governor refused a court order to remove the National Guard troops, President Eisenhower ordered units of the United States Army into Little Rock. In a speech broadcast to the nation, the president stated, "Mob rule cannot be allowed to override the decisions of the court." On September 25, 1957, under federal troop escort, the Little Rock Nine made it inside for their first full day of school. Under the order of the President, National Guard troops remained at Central High for the remainder of the school year to ensure the safety of the Little Rock Nine. Ernest Green became the first black graduate of Central High the following spring. I corresponded with Terrence Roberts about his experience integrating Central High School. When describing how he was treated by his teachers at Central High, he stated, "In the main, the teachers were not happy to see the 9 of us. My English teacher asked me why I wanted to go to their school since I had a school of my own. When asked what the greatest lesson learned from the events at Central High, he stated, the biggest thing was that people will go to great lengths to oppose changes that are not seen favorable to them." As public and state government support for desegregation grew, leaders in southern states gradually implemented plans to desegregate their schools. In 1961, only 3 southern states, South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi, still maintained completely segregated school systems.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
The Brown decision resulted in educational reform throughout the United States and was the starting point for the civil rights movement. After addressing equality in education, the NAACP worked to end the practice of separate but equal throughout every part of society. The fight for equal rights may have started with African Americans, but it eventually expanded to include other racial and ethnic minorities, women, and people with disabilities. It has been 57 years since the Brown decision, and there is still much work to be done. Segregation in schools still exists today, but not because it is required by law, but because of other factors such as income levels and prejudice. It has been widely publicized in recent years that African American students do not perform as well in school as their white peers. The No Child Left Behind Act was passed by the government to help correct this achievement gap. 57 years ago, it would have been hard for Linda Brown and her parents to imagine that in November 2008, the first black president of the United States of America would be elected. There may be more to do in the fight for equal opportunity in America, but looking back, no one can deny that real progress has been made.
Imagine no